Good evening. If I could please have your attention. My name is John Burtka, and on behalf of the Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy, I'd like to welcome you to today's lecture entitled The Impact of War on Military Readiness. This evening's presentation provides us the opportunity to learn about how the costs of maintaining America's global empire, with nearly 200,000 troops stationed in over 150 countries, fighting at least 9 undeclared wars throughout the world, undermine military readiness and threaten the safety and happiness of the American people. Before we get started, I'd like to say a brief word about our host today. The Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy brings together people from across the political spectrum on a monthly basis to discuss the most important issues relating to national security with the aim of restoring the authority of the Constitution in order to create a more peaceful and secure world. In their own words, the Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy believes that the United States must pursue a realistic and restrained foreign policy. Foundational to responsible and thoughtful foreign policy is the need for congressional consent for all acts of war. Too often, Congress has taken a back seat in directing military actions, acquiescing to the president. The Constitution spells out in Article 1 that the authority to authorize war comes exclusively from Congress. And we gather here today in the shadow of Capitol Hill to address how America's numerous undeclared and consequentially unconstitutional wars consume trillions of dollars in taxpayer money and prevent our military from having the resources to train and maintain the personnel and equipment needed to protect America's vital national interests. Moreover, beyond the unsustainable financial costs of recruiting and retaining our, quote, all-volunteer force, today's speaker also highlights the substantial ethical and moral questions at play. For example, does our reliance on private contractors in the battlefield, our enemies might call them mercenaries, due to low recruitment numbers, compromise the right of sovereign nations to a monopoly on violence for state purpose? Does the fact that only 1% of our population provides for the defense of the other 99%, and that of that 1%, the state of Alabama, with 4.8 million people, has more soldiers serving in the Army than D.C., New York, and L.A. combined, with 25 million people? Does that fact threaten the foundation of our democracy and fuel today's growing populist sentiment? And if more of our soldiers came from the children of prominent politicians and the corporate leadership class, would Washington be less inclined to fight, or rather, to send others to fight our endless wars? According to today's speaker, you goddamn better believe it. That's a direct quote. With 99% of Americans having little to no skin in the game, and with declining recruitment numbers heavily dependent on perks like bonuses and student loan repayments, the question now becomes, who will fight our next war? And if the enemy were on the shore, would Americans actually take up arms to defend their nation? Without further ado, I will introduce tonight's speaker, who will tackle these questions head on. Colonel Larry Wilkerson is Distinguished Adjunct Professor of Government and Public Policy at the College of William and Mary. His last positions in government were as Secretary of State Colin Powell's Chief of Staff, Associate Director of the State Department's Policy Planning Staff under the directorship of Ambassador Richard N. Haas, and member of the staff responsible for East Asia and the Pacific, political and legislative affairs. Before serving at the State Department, Wilkerson served 31 years in the U.S. Army. During that time, he was a member of the faculty of the U.S. Naval War College, special assistant to General Powell when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and director and deputy director of the U.S. Marine Corps War College at Quantico, Virginia. Wilkerson retired from active service in 1997 as colonel and began work as an advisor to General Powell. He has also taught national security affairs in the honors program at George Washington University. He is currently working on a book about the first George W. Bush administration. I'd invite you to join me in giving a warm welcome to Colonel Wilkerson.
Right before I came here, I was doing a Zoom meeting with my student veterans group at William & Mary, whom I am the faculty advisor for, and I try to stay with them all the time as much as I can, but I told them over the microphone and the system that we have, which is a little scratchy, but it works most of the time. State of art of technology is not what it is touted to be often. I told them I was coming to do what I'm about to do now, and they essentially said, "Give them hell, Colonel." No one in America knows the truth as viscerally and as vividly as these veterans, I assure you. Those who are at William & Mary are fortunate indeed, and fortunate in two ways now, thank God. The oldest public university in America, only exceeded in age by Harvard, and it's private, so we don't count them, was really not doing that good a job for veterans. And so recently we got our first woman president in 390 plus years. One board member said, "Why break with tradition?" And we had breakfast with her last week at the Army-Navy Club, and I hope she means every word she said, because it's about to change at William & Mary. I'll give you an idea. We have 15 veterans. Old Dominion has 500. UVA has 300. We have 15. We're going to change that. And I've got a really dynamic crew. All 15 of them are working hard right now. 3 of them are Marines, and you haven't seen anybody work until you've seen a Marine. And we're going to change that situation. But just to repeat, they know. They know. If you want to see what they know, watch the video that I watched on the train here today. I'd watched it one time before, a couple of days ago, but I had to watch it again because I wanted to pick up on some of the language that the cadets are using, that the staff is using, that indeed the colonel on the stage is using, as he interviews in front of the cadets and staff at West Point, C.J. Chivers, author of The Gun, the book about the Kalashnikov and how it's empowered all manner of people around the world because of its simplicity, the logistic ease with which its ammunition is maintained and carried, and the fact that you don't have to know how to shoot. You just pull the trigger. And then his latest book, The Fighters, which is about these men and women I have at William & Mary and who are arrayed all across college campuses from California to New York. And CJ makes some comments in that tape in front of those cadets and in front of the staff and faculty, almost all of whom are veterans of Afghanistan or Iraq or both, that are just bone-chilling about the all-volunteer force, about war that is unconstitutional, about the civil-military divide that is developing in the country, and so forth. But one of the most potent things he says, because he was a Marine for 8 years, and he bears some of the blame, and he admits it, for not speaking up sometimes when stupid things were happening, when idiotic things were happening. But he sums it all up when he answers a question of a major out in the audience who, from the question you can tell, has been in the combat zone too. And he answers the question with, the ultimate question we should be asking is, who the hell is the architect of this shit? Who planned this? Who caused us to be here in the first place? For what are we fighting? And whom are we fighting? And he weaves those questions again and again through that interview. And there aren't any answers, but he tries to proffer some. And he blames himself too, because he made it up fairly high in the officer ranks, not to the general officer ranks, but given that he was only in the short time he was, to make lieutenant colonel and be a battalion commander was pretty amazing. And he says, I was guilty too. But we have incompetent, in many respects, leaders in the Army and the Marine Corps and the Air Force. Because I don't mean they're incompetent in their skills in terms of the military or in terms of the weapons systems. I mean, they won't say no. They just keep saying, give me more troops, give me more money, give me more troops, give me more money. Or they say something like this. This is hot off the press. Today's military is overweight in pain and taking sleep aids daily. This is Tom Ricks. Or they do something like this. This is from Jim Mattis. And I have to say that when I read this, I felt like my estimation of Jim Mattis had dropped dramatically. Mattis orders fighter jet readiness to jump to 80% in 1 year. Now, what does that mean and why does that irritate me? Because here is what I said back to the friend who sent me that. There are two methods for achieving such rates under conditions that largely will not alter and probably will worsen. One, lie about the operationally ready rates. And two, work 24 hours a day in 2 shifts, 6 days a week. Incidentally, my son's Reaper Squadron, that's drones, is about to that point today and is wearing out the personnel badly, and frankly, I'm very concerned about my son's mental state. 12 hours at a terminal, the last 4 of which you are a basket case, and having to be watched by all your officers to make sure you don't do something really stupid. But that's what they're doing because they're so short. Having been in the Army, I continued, 31 years, and in Army aviation for about half of that, my guess they'll lie. That's my guess, they'll lie. We did. This will not simply undercut readiness. It will make Mattis look good, along with the Air Force, until the balloon goes up. Then all will look very, very bad. So these leaders pray they end their hours before such reckonings. Given the vicissitudes of life, they likely will. Some poor sucker down the road will eat their mistakes. My estimation of Jim has dropped off dramatically. This is what we do. We lie, we cheat, we do whatever's necessary in the military. Been there, done that. Sat at the feet of one of the most capable, powerful men in America, Colin Powell, and watched us do that from time to time. That's what we do when the American people tell us to do something, and we are the can-do boys and girls. And so we do it however way we can. It is so serious right now in the Air Force. Those of you who know this, F-22, F-35, F-15, F-16, the fighter community that Jim has just ordered to do the impossible, is so short of pilots and others associated with the airplanes. And these airplanes are so sophisticated. They lie about the time. You know, an F-35 only takes 10 hours of maintenance to fly 1 hour. That's hogwash. It's twice that long. That's midnight oil being burned and so forth. Well, if there's no one to burn the midnight oil, you can't hardly do it. The Air Force is about 2,000 pilots in that community short right now. It is so short, it's paying $500,000 on the barrelhead for a 12-year re-up and $250,000 for a 6-year re-up. They're about to do the same thing in the drone community. We are paying in my Army $40,000 on the barrelhead just to get you to sign. And yet, you saw the statistics I sent you. The Army failed to meet its goals this time. President Trump can ask all day long for the Navy to grow more ships, the Army to grow more people. I'm sorry, Americans are not going to volunteer. You won't be able to pay them enough. Now, granted, if you're a Virginia 18-year-old or a West Virginia 18-year-old or a Mississippi or Alabama 18-year-old and you see $40,000, that's a lot of money to you. But if you just graduated from Harvard, that's your first week's paycheck. So you're not going to get anybody from Harvard. You're going to get the kids from West Virginia and the interior of Maine and Oklahoma and so forth, the states that lead the charts in terms of recruiting, and yet they're falling off. And the Army's polling shows right now, in my experience in the classroom, anecdotally at least, verifies this, Generation Xers Their proclivity to be recruited has fallen off the cliff. Absolutely off the cliff. They are not going to be bribed. They are not going to serve. So what you're going to do is what the Army did this year when it fell so far short. You're going to go for mental category 4. That's people who can't read their name on a guard roster. You're going to go for waivers on things like drugs and crime and so forth. You're going to do whatever you need to do because that's what the military does. You tell them to recruit, they will recruit. Now, the Army failed this year to recruit. And I love the shot that came from my favorite shipyards in Norfolk, Virginia, when President Trump said he was going to build 54 more ships. And then the remarks that came from the most prestigious magazine the Navy produces, Naval Institute Proceedings. First was a remark from the shipyards, well, Mr. President, give us 7 or 8 years and we might be able to hire the people to build the ships. And then the remark from the Admiral in Proceedings was, we can't man the ships we have now. Why do you think we built Zumwalt? I was in Bath, Maine when they launched her. She's a beautiful, magnificent, high-tech looking thing, but the reason they built her was because she takes 1/3 the crew complement that a regular destroyer or cruiser does. It's automated. Now, what does that do to you? We have not lost a ship in the United States Navy. I studied at the Naval War College. My master's thesis was on submarines in direct support of the carrier battle group. I know a little naval stuff. The commandant made me head of his war college. Only Army officer ever to be there, but I know a little naval stuff. You cannot do what we've done for the past half century in saving ships if you have such a small crew complement. We are the best damage control people in the world. We learned it from the Brits. You haven't seen a ship hit in the Persian Gulf by 2 Exocet missiles sink? No, she came back to home port and was repaired. You haven't seen a ship hit by Al-Qaeda in Port Aden, Yemen in 2000? No, she was badly damaged, but she made it home. The reason is because those crew members risked their lives, some of them to the nth degree, to save that ship. Well, if you're down to only 70 when you should have 230 on board, you're not going to do the damage control you need to do. And here's another one for you. And this is another admiral writing in Proceedings. I love him. He knew he wasn't going to take on, he's an Airedale. He's a pilot. Former CAG, Carrier Air Group Commander. He wasn't going to take on the lobby for aircraft carriers in the Navy directly, so he started very subtly in his article. And he said, let's just examine a carrier going down in the Taiwan Strait. And by the way, when Bill Clinton put those 2 carriers in the Taiwan Strait in 1998, don't ever think that'll happen again. The Chinese will sink one of those carriers so fast it'll make your head spin. And that's what this admiral was postulating. And he said, okay, let's just examine what's going to happen when that happens. First, you've got 5,000 plus men and women in the water or dead. You also lost $14 billion, counting the air wing a little bit more. But here's what I'm telling you, and he's saying this back to the active Navy. You don't even have enough berths on your escorts in that strike group to rescue those men and women in the water. Now that's real talk from a real sailor. And he's describing reality. When we lose that carrier, and we are going to, a 65 centimeter wake-homing torpedo, a Mach 2 missile, probably both together, we're going to lose a carrier or 2. We can't even rescue the men and women on the carrier because we have made our thinking so damnably obsolete. Can't even rescue the people in the water. And I'm not even talking about the ethical and moral issues, which were highlighted quite well. I'm not talking about the fact that only 1% of us is bleeding and dying for the rest of us. Many of those 1% would say, well, that's fine, that's all right. I don't mind that. Scratch them a little deeper and see if they don't mind it. I'm at Walter Reed. I'm over there to help an Air Force friend of mine work the Wounded Warrior Project for the Air Force for a day or two. These guys had never seen a soldier before over there, so he dragged me along. And he says, I'm going to introduce you to Joe. And I'm sitting in the lobby of that magnificent new building over there, and down the stairs comes this Air Force tech sergeant who's missing both his legs below the knee and his right arm below the elbow. And he comes over and he sits down at the table, and you say, how did he do that? Well, 19 surgeries and a lot of really patriotic Americans who volunteered money for a lot of the surgery and a lot of prosthetics and other things he had. He even had a van he could drive. It was specially rigged so he could drive it. But he comes over and he sits down and he's got this, we call it in the Army a shit-eating grin on his face. And I said, what's so funny, Joe? And he said, well, I just shooed a congressional delegation out of my office. I said, how'd you do that? He said, well, I just got tired of it. He said, there was about 7 of them. He said, I don't know how many of them were actual members. There might have been some staff, but he said, they came in my office and the first thing that 3 or 4 of them said was, thank you for your service. I said, I stopped them mid-sentence and I said, don't thank me for my service. I'm conflicted over that. Thank me for my sacrifice. You can see that plainly. And he had this big smile on his face because he felt like he'd done his service for the day. He was saying the same thing Chivers was saying in that video. Who are the architects? Who put me in Afghanistan in front of that IED with me defusing it, with 1 month left on my tour in Afghanistan after doing a full tour in Iraq too and surviving, and a command detonated bomb took my legs and my right arm off. And he said, if my buddy hadn't called me inside my suit and I had a little problem with the comms, so I stood up, that's when it was command detonated, I probably would have died. And then he looked at me with that look that anyone like that has from time to time and said, I wish I had. Because he knew his life was going to be very, very changed after that. But the question that rang in his ears and in CJ's ears and that was put to those cadets at West Point was, who is the architect of this shit? Who made this plan? Who did this and for what reason? And I would submit to you that every single American should take a moment of silence maybe, and ponder that question. Because the answer, ultimately, if we still are in our imperial status, a facsimile of a democratic federal republic, every American is the answer to that man's question. We all put him there and them there. And we put them there under circumstances less than an existential threat to this country. And in many cases, we keep them there in those circumstances. I have not met a single veteran of any service. Maybe there is one out there. But I haven't met him or her who says that 9/11 wasn't justification for going to Afghanistan. Knocking al-Qaeda out as best as possible, punishing the Taliban who supported them, and then leaving. And leaving with the message clear, ringing in everyone's ears. Do it again, and we'll come back and do it again. And again, and again, and again. Don't think we would have had a problem doing that, except that we would have saved 15 and a half, 16 years of interminable warfare. Now, I'll let you in on another little clue. Donald Trump has turned Afghanistan over, as far as I know, to the Pentagon. So for the first time in the history of that theater, some strategic thinking has gone on with regard to Afghanistan. Here's that strategic thinking. And I, as a military professional, I do not necessarily disagree with it, but I think the American people ought to know about it. We're not in Afghanistan any longer to fight the Taliban, al-Qaeda, ISIS, or build a state. Those are ancillary tasks that maybe the State Department would be better at in many cases. We're there for 3 very important strategic reasons. And we will be there, as we have been in Germany, for the next half century. 1, to be positioned with hard power, very difficult position to get into, ask Donald Rumsfeld, along the base road initiative through Central Asia of the Chinese, in case we have to impact that initiative with hard power. The second reason we're there is because we're cheek and jowl with the most potentially unstable nuclear stockpile in the world in Pakistan. We want to be able to hop out of Afghanistan on top of that nuclear stockpile and secure it if we have to. And the third reason we're there is because there are 20 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang province in China, and they don't like the Han Chinese very much. In fact, they have some groups already that are contesting militarily, such as they can, Beijing. So we're there in Afghanistan to cover a CIA operation into that western province, should we have to conduct one, that would use those 20 million Uyghurs to as best as possible destabilize Beijing, should we be in conflict with them. Now, as I said, as a military professional, I used to do this sort of strategic thinking and planning. But when are we going to tell the American people if that is indeed why we're still in Afghanistan? And does even, and I'll throw this question out, does even the President of the United States know that his Pentagon has that strategic purpose under its hat? Or has he so turned that theater over to the Pentagon that whatever they want to do is okay? These are the kinds of things that my students study every Monday for 3 hours and have for some 17 years. One of the things I sometimes ask them after they have studied Allen Dulles and Dwight Eisenhower and Winston Churchill and a host of others, overthrow of Mohammed bin Salman in Iran in 1953, and then moving right on to Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 54, all the way up to Ronald Reagan and Iran-Contra. I bet you didn't know that Ronald Reagan ran 59 covert operations with Bill Casey, a demented man at the CIA during 8 years of his administration. But the only one we really know a lot about is Iran-Contra. And I look at my students and I say, now think about this for a moment. What is your CIA doing this moment that you'll read about in 25 years and maybe be ashamed of as a citizen, or maybe marvel at as a citizen? You know, overthrowing Mossadegh brought 26 years of stability with the Shah, but it also built a rapport, if that's the right word, between Tehran and Washington that seems like it might lead to war any moment now. And you know, Iran, I listened to John Bolton. Oh God, I know John Bolton too well. I listened to him talk about the threat that Iran presents, and I want to say, John, Saddam Hussein fought Iran for 8 long, brutal years, and neither one of them won. We beat Saddam Hussein in 19 hours. How are they an existential threat to anybody? Think about that for a minute. And yet, that's the kind of logic the architects, to use CJ's words, use in order to send these young men and women to fight. The Greeks had a saying, old men send young men to die. Well, now it's young women too. And there's a commission right now studying whether or not women should be incorporated in the selective service system. And you and I both could sit here and put money on that and we'd be rich. Studying whether or not the selective service system should be maintained at all. And if it should be maintained, should it stay the way it is, or should it be put in the Defense Department? Of course, that's just a move to get the $25 million annual cost of it under the DOD bill and not have to appropriate anything extra. They'll have to take it out of their hide probably. But just think about that for a minute. What's that commission going to decide, and what are going to be the ramifications of it, political and otherwise? I have been in all 50 states in the last 10 years, some of them multiple times. The one thing that I sometimes say that gets people really, really angry, and in one case in Minnesota got a grandfather coming across the balustrade at me, is that we might draft their daughters. You think that's going to be an easy thing? And yet, we might have to. In 1863, when Lincoln introduced conscription during our Civil War, he had to send a Union division to New York to quell the riots, and people died, and he could ill spare that division. We're looking at a similar situation right now, I think, if we have to go back to conscription suddenly in the middle of a crisis, again in this country. If you haven't talked to some of these young people, if you haven't been across the country, if you haven't talked even to their families. At Ohio State, last year we had our 3rd symposium on the all-volunteer force. We had 2 sociologists who just finished the study. No political axe to grind in this study, but they wanted to find out just how balanced or unbalanced, as it turned out, the situation with the armed forces is today. So they went back as far as they could find data. They found a little in the Civil War, they found a lot in World War I, and they found just a load for World War II, Korea, and as you might imagine, conflicts beyond. And they then put all that data together to see whether the situation today is like the past or orders of magnitude different. They thought it would probably be like the past because we've never had a fair draft or anything else regarding war, but they didn't think it would be the difference they uncovered. It is massive today. It is almost all from the 4th and 5th quintile in this country of affluence and education. So then they said, if it's so dramatic, let's pull some political scientists into this and let's see if it has a political impact. And they put their questions together, controlled for other factors and variables, and went out to about 3,000, I think it was, of the different families that were included in the survey, all over the country in every state. And what they found was, yes, it dramatically impacts their politics. And what they found with regard to the 2016 election, and then with the comments made about it, was it had a lot to do with the some 60 or 70% of the enlisted ranks who voted for President Trump. Now, don't even, I'm not going to say good or bad on that. What I'm telling you is that they heard him say that Iraq was a fiasco. They heard him say that he was not for this state building stuff. They heard him say that he was not for these crazy wars and everything, and that had a political impact. The thing that struck us, though, in the All-Volunteer Force Forum was just how much our anecdotal information from veterans all around, all services, was confirmed by this very exquisite survey and study that these scientists did. This is the most unbalanced time in our history. And that, in and of itself, impacts readiness. I mean, I could stand up here and tell you that when you spend 17 years in Afghanistan and don't fire your main tank gun, don't fire your 8-inch howitzer or your 155 howitzer, don't fire your mlrs or anything else, you atrophy in terms of your ability to fight in that existential or near existential conflict. Take China, for example. Or when you do nothing but freedom of navigation exercises and all you're ever doing is 1 or 2 ships, and suddenly you're thrust into a real naval battle on the high seas, and you don't have enough escorts even to rescue your people off a carrier, you're in trouble. And here's the big issue. In the past, I'll admit this, we have done the same thing. When George Marshall came to the helm in 1939, he was appalled. And he fired many, many officers because they were just too curmudgeonly, they were just too out of it, they weren't seized of the matter, they weren't smart, creative, entrepreneurial, and so forth. So he got rid of them. So we've done this sort of thing in the past. Democracies tend to do this sort of thing. The question today, though, is, given the array of really big threats out there and the way we have spent our military on the peripheries of our empire, doing things less than existential and in some cases less than approved by the American people, can we do that? Or are we going to get caught short and either have 10 or 15 or 20 times the casualties we should have, or maybe even lose? That's the ultimate question about what we're doing today, and we aren't ready yet to confront that question. Thank you.
I thought I heard the word mercenaries
Yes.
invoked. Can you tell
We
me?
went from 7,000 to 200,000 in just, what, 15 years?
Yeah. Well, on another note, speaking of mercenaries, I know that Eric Prince has been in the news lately. He's still in Afghanistan trying to peddle this idea that he could take 6,500 of his mercenaries and turn the place around in 6 months. I was just wondering what you thought of the idea of putting in private troops and swapping them out with our troops to end this war in Afghanistan.
I really have a problem as both an academic and a citizen with privatizing the ultimate state function, killing people for state purposes. I really do. The British tried it a little bit every now and then in their empire, particularly in India. It didn't work very well. They brought back the civil service types immediately and the regular military immediately because it had all kinds of ramifications, and that was then. It's a different time now. I think Eric Prince's solution would probably be much like the solution of Captain Medina and Lieutenant Calley and others at My Lai in Vietnam. I could fix the situation too. I'd just eradicate all the problems. You know, can Eric Prince do that? Yeah, he could probably do that. Assassinate the tribal leaders, assassinate the next person in, and so forth. And, you know, you could probably make it look like you were controlling things in Afghanistan. The question is what would happen as soon as he left and that iron glove were taken away. I'm not even sure he could do that. But I just don't like the idea of privatizing war.
Thanks very much for that really brilliant presentation. I wanted to ask you to relate the lack of the problems of preparedness in the Navy and the Air Force that you've alluded to a broader question, a broader problem, as I understand it, that the United States military is now in a situation where they are, and the Pentagon as well, are in a situation where they are pretending that the United States is still the dominant military force in the world in the way that it was in the 1950s and 1960s, whereas in reality that's no longer the case. That other powers, other states have achieved the capability to defeat the United States in terms of efforts by the United States to approach their seashores, their coasts, or their borders in a way that was not the case decades earlier. Do you agree with that? And could you assess the broader problem here in terms of whether the United States is in fact continuing to pretend to be the dominant military power, whereas in fact that's no longer the case?
I take some exception to that. I'm not going to say that given what I've described briefly and trends that are presently in operation, I would say it could get that way. But right now, just surveying the world and looking at the hardware laydown from every angle, and I'll make a caveat here with regard to cyber war. Okay, we'll put that over there for a second. But in terms of more or less conventional or nuclear hardware, the two aspects that are really still dominant, I'd say we could get a bloody nose. We'd lose, for example, if we started a sea war, which is probably how it would start, with the Chinese, we'd probably lose a couple or three carriers before we came to some sort of stasis and maybe worked it out. Now, let me hasten to add, every war game that I ever participated in, and I did one every year, it was called JLAS, where all the services participated, usually the Japanese, others too. In every scenario where we defended Taiwan, for example, that's what happens. You come to a point of stasis. We've shot their Air Force out of the air for all practical purposes. They won't fly anymore because they get shot down. And we have sunk their southern fleet and much of the rest of their fleet, so much that they've turned to what we call in the Navy a fleet in being. In other words, they're somewhere hiding. They won't venture forth to get you. But we've lost a lot too. We've lost significant assets, and if we were attacked by someone else at that time, we'd be in deep trouble. So what happens is the civilian leaders, and mind you, in these war games, the civilian leaders are people like George Shultz and Jim Baker and Howard Baker and so forth. They're people who know what they're talking about when they play the president or the Secretary of Defense or whatever. They start looking at nuclear weapons. And the red team, who's schooled in, speaks fluent Mandarin, Chinese affairs, starts looking at nuclear weapons too. And so what you wind up with, generally, we a couple of times went on with the game and started low and moved up even further, and then we stopped. But most of the time in those games, the civilian leaders and the military would agree to stop right there because they did not want to start a nuclear exchange. It would be something like this. We would get this idea that, well, if we pop a TLAM-D or two, this was when we had the Tomahawk nuclear warhead, if we pop a TLAM-D or two on coastal cities and maybe float one into Shanghai, that'll convince them. Well, it didn't. The Chinese just shot back. And now we've got a situation which we have caused largely with our uproar over North Korea and getting Abe to think about nuclear weapons. And believe me, I know Japan, he is thinking about nuclear weapons. Now we've caused the Chinese to revisit their whole nuclear strategy. Their strategy was always what Mao made it. Mao said, I don't like nuclear weapons, they're too expensive, no one ever is going to use them, so all I want is a few. Well, now because of the nuclear arms race potential in Northeast Asia, the Chinese in the Central Party School and elsewhere that I try to stay plugged into, they're thinking about revising their strategy and having enough weapons to ride out a first strike and then make a retaliatory strike. That's a hell of a change in Northeast Asia too. So you don't want to go there. I mean, the military didn't want to go there, the civilian leaders didn't want to go there, but that's where you wind up. And my Marines gave me a cup when I left the War College, and the cup said, the shark and the elephant. And they knew I would know what that meant because one of my Marines stood up in the middle of the war game at Maxwell Air Force Base, all these people around, admirals, generals, and everything else, and he said, I see what it is. It's what Wilkerson said it was in seminar. The shark can't eat the elephant, and the elephant can't eat the shark. That's what you have. You have such strategic depth in China, like the Soviet Union when Hitler invaded, or Napoleon invaded, or the Teutonites invaded well before them. You just don't want to contemplate putting ground. Remember the Princess Bride? Don't ever start a land war in Asia? There's some truth in that. So you're sitting there with half your military assets expended on both sides, and you don't know how to grapple with one another. So you go to nukes. It's not a scenario you want to see develop.
I was in China 3 years ago, and among other places, we visited the Seven Gorges, or whatever it's called, the tremendous hydroelectric plant they've made in the Yangtze River.
Right.
And I always read whatever I can or see. And one of the comments in there was the Chinese government was saying that the dams were designed to allow very rapidly to reduce the hot level of the lake behind. And meaning, and they said, if there was a nuclear attack on the dam, which is a tremendous, one of the biggest in the world.
It's huge,
you know,
right? Yeah.
if there was a nuclear attack on the dam, or the threat of it, they would be lowering the water levels beforehand. If the dam was nuked, I think the water would go down to Shanghai. It would certainly do incredible flooding damage.
Yes. Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah.
But
the same way that with the Ruhr when we and the British were thinking about taking out those dams.
Well,
and did try some.
What impressed me was that they got their feet on the ground. They're no dummies. And that's part of it's in their plans or strategy that this could happen. It could only be the US or Russia that could destroy the dam. But that it was in their calculus that the day might come where the dam would be destroyed. Obviously, then, remember, it was really after we attacked.
Could be a Uyghur terrorist who got his hands on a small-yield nuclear weapon, too.
Oh, but I don't know, take a pretty big bomb, I suppose. But whatever.
About a half KT would do it in the right place.
But remember, it was only after we bombed Kosovo that the Chinese then began a big restructure of their nuclear plan. Because before that, everyone believed us that democracies don't start wars. And they really believed it until we did it.
Well, they thought we hit their little consulate or embassy there on purpose.
Intentionally, yeah. So I'm just saying they're prepared. Two things stuck in my mind. They're prepared for the worst. Destroying that dam would be one of the worst damages you can imagine. The second point I felt in visiting Asia several times, that all the Chinese, some are very friendly to America, but if we really get a war in China, all the Chinese, the overseas Chinese, all our supposed friends would still side with China if it came to that against us. Just that feeling of being, 100 years of abuse, etc. They would not stay with us if it came to that.
I would just take exception with that last statement, much the way I hope I would have taken exception in 39, 40, 41 with regard to the Japanese. I know a lot of Chinese who are patriotic Americans. I take your point, though.
I mean the ones in Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
I don't mean here.
Yeah, there are. And Mao's philosophy still, in another way, his philosophy was two-pronged about nuclear weapons. You shoot 20 at me, and you might kill 100 million Chinese, I'll still have 500 million left at that time. I'm going to shoot mine at Los Angeles, New York, Washington, and Houston, and you're going to really hurt. And that was Mao's brutal way of looking at it, that he didn't need a whole lot because he could stop us just by incinerating a few of our major cities. That's no longer the way they're thinking. I kind of know Wang Yi because Richard Haas and I met with Wang Yi and Shui Tenkai, now the ambassador here in Washington, two of the most competent people, diplomats and other. I mean, Wang Yi did not get moved up to the political counselor level now, above foreign minister, still keeping the foreign minister portfolio, which is just a step from the Politburo, because he's, not a good guy. Wang Yi is swift. He is really first rate. Wang Yi has changed very much from the time he told Richard Haas and I in the summer of 2001 in Beijing that the Chinese really did not mind the U.S. 7th Fleet in the South China Sea or in the Western Pacific because it assured them of stability too, and what they were really interested in was stability for their economic growth and so forth. They have changed majorly. And the reason, you got to think about this for a minute. Remember Eisenhower's farewell speech and the military-industrial complex and so forth? Well, the Chinese have got to deal with this sort of thing too. They have built a significant military-industrial complex themselves now. So the generals and the admirals who are, in some cases, spoiling for a fight, much the way that F-8 pilot was spoiling for a fight that ran into our EP-3 in April of 2001 and put our EP-3 down on Hainan Island and created a crisis, killed the F-8 pilot. They're spoiling for a fight. And the civilians who have always thought that they could, at the end of the day, control this complex are beginning to realize that to a certain extent they've created a monster. And so you get a bunch of retired admirals and generals, for example, meeting with us outside Hong Kong, us being a group of academics from the Naval War College and other places, CNA, Center for Naval Analyses, and they start talking very differently from what we're used to Navy admirals and generals talking about. They start talking about things like they could beat us. They start talking about things like it's inevitable. There will be a fight. And you can say, well, these are retired guys and they're in their cups or whatever. And maybe we were saying similar things back to them and so forth. But it was a different tint and tone. I hadn't heard that kind of language before. And I've been plugged into China I guess since the first time I went there with General Vesey and my admiral in 1984. It's a different China now. Power does things to people. And I used to say, well, China's not an aggressive nation. It's never gone abroad to kill people. It's not project power, all this kind of stuff. You know, well, they're in Djibouti now. They're contemplating going other places. Power changes you when that power accumulates. And when it accumulates in certain ways, it changes you in those ways. And military power that grows up and gets really big and itching for a fight and is well funded and so forth, you know, you look at it and you say, what was it Madeleine Albright said to Colin Powell? You know, you're always talking about that military. Can't we use it sometime?
2015, under the Obama administration, obviously the Saudi Arabia started attacking in Yemen, and the Houthis were trying to take over Sana'a, and Saudi Arabia has just been shelling. So this is an unauthorized war, and it's just been escalating more and more, obviously with American refueling of Saudi warplanes and targeting assistance. And now we have Green Berets on the ground. So
Green Berets fighting against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, whom the Saudis are arming and financing because they fight the Houthis.
So I want to know sort of your thoughts on the implications of, you know, further escalation for U.S. involvement, even troops on the ground in Yemen.
Well, you know, the first problem as a military professional that I have with that, and I'll speak that way first, is Mohammed bin Salman has made that war his. He's also made the break with Qatar his. And he's destabilized the GCC. It never was a powerful alliance anyway, but he's just ruined it. It's gone. It's dead. That's at both ends of his spectrum, as it were. I don't give him much more than 12 to 18 months in power. One of those billionaires he's got stuck in house arrest is going to hire somebody or whatever, or they're just going to disappear him. They just disappeared somebody, apparently, journalist. Maybe he'll just fall from power and someone else will be anointed. This is his war now, and he's losing. He's losing badly, just as the Egyptians under Nasser did in the 60s. The old Egyptian military people, they look at Yemen as their Vietnam. That's how they look at it. So that's the first thing I would say. He's losing, and when he loses badly and probably is toppled, then I'm not saying the House of Saud will go down. I'm just saying they're going to get a new ruler. And we're going to be right there with him. And what are we going to do at that point? Probably about the same thing we're doing right now. You got John Hanna at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the same John Hanna that shadowed me at the CIA as we were building the lies for Colin Powell's presentation at the UN, writing all about how Saudi Arabia and UAE, oh, they're garden spots, you know, and Iran's the biggest state sponsor of terrorism in the world is Saudi Arabia. We know that, but we won't do anything about it. That's a question. I mean, why? Who's the architect of this thing? Who's doing this? Why do we feel that way? I got a feeling it's mostly about money, but in any event, it's a very perilous situation for MBS and for his mentor in the Emirates, and it's perilous for us because we're attached to it. And right now, the region does not think that that is a Saudi war. They think it's a U.S. war with the Saudis being our proxy. And that's what Al-Qaeda thinks too, and that's the reason their recruitment is up. So it's a very dangerous situation, not to even mention, now take my military hat off, the humanitarian disaster that it is with the cholera, the lack of food, and the humanitarian disaster is going to be even deeper and more profoundly if we don't stop this thing. If we don't bring some kind of really meaningful political pressure to bear on Saudi Arabia, they'll never stop until they lose. It's that simple. And they'll kill a lot of people in that process.
All right, I think that's it for tonight. Let's give a round of applause to the speakers.
Thank you. Thank you for good questions.